Thank you. I've loved the great variety of talks we've had today, and I'm going to ask you to be a little bit patient with me as I get started, because I'm going to try to slow things down just a little bit for a moment. I want to start by asking you to imagine a book, a printed book, in fact. We've been making books for a few hundred years now, and we've had a lot of time to explore the form. We've had letterpress editions, hand-bound zines, cheap paperbacks, leather-bound hardcovers, die-cut jackets. We've explored the form without yet exhausting it, even though it's been hundreds of years since we've been spending time with it. We've had so many books, we had to build libraries to navigate the abundance of books, catalogs to say where books belonged, to say which books belonged and which didn't. From books, we created bookstores, and with them, packaging design. The book cover begat the cereal box, the grocery store, the superstore. When we first arrived on the web, we borrowed the language of books. We browse web pages the same way we browsed the pages of a book. The browser is an invention of the book. It's easy today, as technology is changing, to imagine that the book is in opposition to technology, that technology is replacing it. But that is incorrect. The book is not opposed to technology. The book is technology. It's the apotheosis of technology. It's technology that has done something that most tech will never do. It's become so ingrained in our lives, so common and expected, that we no longer see it as technology. We see it as nature, as something natural that's always been there and always will be. I bring up the book because I want to talk about designing for change, and by that I mean designing for systems that are themselves subject to change, even as we're working with them. And I think the book has a lot to teach us about where we've been and where we're going, and that it continues to inform our work as it itself changes. So to talk about that, I'm going to talk about a little bit of history and a little bit of science, and then I'm going to talk about some of the things I've learned in my own work in the last few years. First, the history. I want to go back to the 15th century, to Germany, in fact, to a gentleman by the name of Johannes Trithemius, who was born in 1462 in the town of Trittenham, which is where he actually took his name. He was a precocious child, really eager with words. As a young man, he taught himself Greek and Latin, tried to get his hands on as many books as he could, was really eager for a university education. But he was born to a modest family, and then, as unfortunately now is often the case, could not afford university. So around the age of 20, he ventured out, traveling around Germany in search of a teacher. And he found himself in the town of Sponheim, which I think is south of here, if my bad American geography is of any use. He's traveling through Sponheim, and he gets caught up in a terrible winter storm. Whiteout conditions, he can't see his hands in front of his face. Desperate for cover, he ducks into the local abbey. And it was there that he found his calling. Not to God, mind you, but to books. See, the abbey had a small but very well-equipped library, and Trithemius would discover what many a young man of his generation would learn, which is that the education that eluded him in the secular world was available within the walls of the church. 10 months after that snowstorm, he took his vows, and 8 months after that, he was elected abbot, and he would spend most of the rest of his life in that abbey, growing the library from the 40 or so books that were there when he arrived to over 2,000 when he passed, either investing or squandering the abbey's fortune depending on which history book you read. Now, as abbot, Trithemius was responsible for the lives of the monks in his care, everything from when they got up in the morning to what they ate, how they spent their days, how they retired in the evening. Obviously, he was responsible for their spiritual lives. That was his first and foremost responsibility. But he also took a very strong interest in their intellectual lives, in their education. He believed he was responsible for teaching them in the ways of the world and helping them teach others. And he thought there was no better way to do that than to take up the work of the scribe. By copying books, and so preserving them and extending them into the future, they could both learn through the act of copying and engrossing themselves in the text, as well as extend that learning on to other people who would pick up those copied books and learn from them as well. It's not clear if Trithemius, it's not clear if Trithemius was aware of other monks who were also at the time spending their time making beer rather than copying books, and whether or not he thought that was a good use of their time. History is unfortunately silent to that fact. So Trithemius is completely committed to the work of the scribe in this time, but the world around him was changing. The printing press had been invented some 50 years before, and printers were cropping up all over Europe, including in his local town. There were some people within the church who were starting to question whether or not the work of the scribe was still valuable. There were young monks who were resisting learning the craft. So Trithemius was started to become concerned that maybe this thing that he felt was so important to the world was passing. He penned a book called In Praise of Scribes. And in that book, he outlined all of the reasons he felt like scribes continued to matter despite the arrival of the printing press, both to the world and to the lives of the monks who continued to do this work. It was completed in 1492, the same year that Columbus would set sail for Asia and, to everyone's surprise, arrive in the Bahamas. And just 25 years before Martin Luther would walk up to Castle Church in Wittenberg, tack his 95 Theses on the wall, and kick off the Reformation. The world was literally becoming bigger and more complex. And here was Trithemius with a very important message to get out to the world, a timely message that if he didn't get out in time, it may not have worked. He may have lost the thing that he cared most about in the world. So what did he do? Naturally, he printed it. In Praise of Scribes was printed in 1494 in a first edition, again a couple of years later, and then it was picked up by a scribe and copied by hand, creating some kind of book inception. So the seminal book, In Defense of Scribes, was printed and distributed through the technology it was purportedly in opposition to. Why? Trithemius' story is often told as a kind of technological determinism, as evidence that once a new technology arrives, we're hopeless to stand in its way. But I think it's more complicated than that. Trithemius was actually a very active user of the printing press. He wrote many books in his lifetime, all of which were printed. The local printer in Sponheim became known casually as the Abbey's press, because at any given time it was probably printing one or more of his titles. He's a very interesting character because in addition to expending a lot of energy and thinking a lot about the work of the scribe, he also wrote a bunch of works on the topic of magic. But they weren't really about magic. You see, Trithemius also coined the word steganography, which is a type of cryptography where you hide a message inside another message. So if when you were in grade school you ever wrote a letter to a friend that ostensibly said, let's meet in the library and go do math homework after school, but if you read up the first letter of every word really said, meet me behind the music classroom at 3 o'clock, we'll have a smoke, you were practicing steganography. So the books on magic were actually ciphers on the topic of steganography. This was not someone who was opposed to technology. He was not a Luddite. I think what's really interesting about Trithemius' story is what it shows us about the way technology changes. He found himself at kind of a crossroads, at a point where some technology was changing, and he was trying to learn how to adapt to the new. And I think we find ourselves in similar places all of the time. So, for example, there are people in this room, probably quite a few of you, who were born long after the record player was made obsolete, but who still have very respectable collections of vinyl. Some of you probably stood in line for the very first iPhones, are now holding iPad minis while you take notes, but you also have a notebook fetish and subscribe to Field Notes and own printed copies of 8 Faces and A Book Apart and the manual. You own all of the A Book Aparts, right? Just checking. There are also many technologies which arise and claim to be ascendant when they turn out not to be. So Jeremy mentioned CD-ROMs earlier, which promised to be the new form of publishing, happily or not. In fact, video did not kill the radio star, despite what MTV promised us. Music videos arrived and, for better or worse, kind of burned out, while radio, in the form of the podcast, is ascendant. In Trithemius' own time, there was a resurgence of interest in calligraphy. So often the moment at which a technology becomes obsolete is also when it's given the opportunity to shine. It's as if the printing press showed up and said, hey, you don't need to write by hand anymore. And people said, actually, I think that means I'm going to learn to write by hand really, really well. So what does this tell us? At any given moment, we are navigating the same kind of problem that Trithemius was. We're trying to look at new technology as it arrives and decide if we want to adopt it or not. And if we adopt it, do we want all of it or only part of it? And how does that work? So if we love mobile phones, does that really mean we have to accept Google Glass? Is it inevitable that the skies will be black with drones? Do we need to build websites that will work in cars and refrigerators and televisions? And if so, how? And do they need to work in IE6? Hopefully not. To answer these questions, I want to turn to the 20th century and to another book, a gentleman by the name of Thomas Kuhn. Kuhn was a physicist. He taught in the mid-20th century in particle physics, a very exciting time in particle physics with Einstein and nuclear physics. There's a lot of things going on in that period. And he probably would have been had a very traditional career as a research physicist, if not for a request that was made by the then president of Harvard. After the war, with the arrival of the bomb and the sense that physics was affecting our lives in a way that we had not been exposed to before, there was a general sense that people of every educational background needed to know something of the sciences. So the president of Harvard approached Kuhn and asked him to teach a class on the physical sciences to liberal arts students, to help them understand what science was about, even though they were not themselves students of that field. To do that, Kuhn dove into history and philosophy of science, and that work ultimately changed his career and culminated in a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, published in 1962. Incidentally, the same class that Kuhn taught in the mid-part of the 20th century was a class that I would take some 50 years later, modeled after the same class that he built, and become so enthralled with physics and so excited by it that I marched myself over to the dean's office, declared my major in physics. Unlike Kuhn, I never bothered to go on to a PhD, so the only thing that degree now qualifies me for is to talk about Schrödinger's cat at cocktail parties. So you know what to ask me later. Back to the book. Kuhn looked at a history of science and all of the ways in which science had changed. So how did we go from, for example, Galileo's understanding of gravity to Newton's, and from Newton's onto Einstein's? How did those shifts occur? And he discovered kind of a four-part sequence that seemed to happen every time one of these shifts happened. In the first part of that sequence, there's a period of normal science. This is the period that most scientists spend most of their careers. So they're working through dominant theory, kind of practicing things, expanding on that theory, exploring it, contributing to it. There's a kind of puzzle-solving aspect to this. You have a belief, you discover something that maybe seems a little bit off, and you figure out how to experiment with it and get it to kind of fold back into that theory. Eventually, some of those puzzles turn out to be anomalies, so things that cannot be easily taken care of, that start to suggest that maybe there's something missing or incomplete about that theory. Those anomalies gather up until a crisis occurs, where it becomes clear that the old theory is no longer accurate and a new one must replace it, and that culminates in what Kuhn called a revolution. So when the old theory is abandoned and a new one adopted. Now, Kuhn talked about this in terms of scientific progression, but I'll argue it's very applicable to the way technology changes as well. And he referred to this whole process as a paradigm shift, the shift when we abandon one paradigm and adopt a new one. Kuhn actually popularized this term, so we throw this word about pretty willy-nilly these days, but it was Kuhn who brought it to the fore. So to take an example from our own work, when the web first arrived, we built fixed pages, borrowing from the language of the book, starting at maybe 640 pixels wide, and then eventually 800, and then 960, and some brave souls got as far as 1024. And this mostly worked, right? If you were willing to admit that the 30% of your readers who were still on the old size were not going to get a very optimal experience, and you could say, yeah, this was okay. But it worked right up until it didn't. Because before long, we realized that there was a dispersion in screen sizes, that this kind of law of averages we were playing wasn't going to work anymore. Because the same person who visited your website on a tiny little cell phone early in the morning was going to turn and visit that same website again from a giant desktop monitor when he sat down at his desk later, and you could not pick a single size to cover both of those scenarios. Those anomalies led to a crisis during which we explored all kinds of other solutions, mobile-only websites, for example, which were obviously a Band-Aid. That crisis, I think, was ultimately resolved with the adoption of responsive web design. Ethan Marcotte's article that introduced the concept of web design was published 3 years ago this week. Now, what Kuhn tells us about this process, I think the really important takeaway in understanding where we're at today, is that the decision to reject one paradigm is always simultaneously the decision to accept another. Now that leads to a kind of awkward situation, right? So you've got one foot firmly rooted in the old paradigm. You can't just willy-nilly jump to any new one that shows up. So you have to kind of explore and experiment and spend some time with it to decide if it's the right one for you. Which means you're constantly straddling two worlds. The old one, which you have to remain committed to until the new one seems right, and the new one, or several new ones that you're exploring. Right? That's where Trithemius stood. 1 foot in the scribal book and 1 foot in the printed book, trying to decide which way he was going to lean. Now, I think that we are sitting in a similar position. We're kind of navigating this place from the book to the web. And there are a lot of kind of incommensurable attributes between those two things that we were dealing with. This is another one of Kuhn's lessons from this, is that usually the old paradigm and the new paradigm conflict in certain ways, and you have to make a choice at some point. So we're going from this static, composed, solitary medium to a dynamic, fluid, collaborative one, and we're trying to navigate that space. And I want to talk a little bit about some tactics for how we can do that. Starting with being modular. This is Editorially. It's the collaborative writing and editing application that I'm working on now. My co-founders are Ethan Marcotte, Jason Santamaria, and David Yee. It's a writing environment. This is the dashboard, which, given that one of my co-founders is Ethan Marcotte, is obviously responsive. This is one of the ways in which we have started to learn how to be modular in the web today. We started to understand the ways in which the pieces of the things that we build need to reshuffle and reflow and move around each other. They need to be kind of independent. This is only on the surface. As important as this is, it's not sufficient. So if we come to the writing app at the heart of Editorially, it's a Markdown-based writing app in the browser. It's a very sophisticated writing app. Works great in all of the modern browsers. But it requires JavaScript, and it requires support of content editable. So it's not going to work everywhere. If you visit this application from a browser that does not support either JavaScript or content editable, you get a simple text area. It's nowhere near as rich an experience, but it works. This kind of modularity in terms of not only the surface about how the design reflows, but how the function gracefully degrades, how the application is built in a method that supports progressive enhancement, is just as important to our work as anything that deals with a typography. It's really easy, I think, as designers today to get caught up in the beauty of an experience, and those are things that I completely care about myself. But it's insufficient. You have to think about how responsive you are all the way down. If you extend this a little bit, you find that there's other ways to think about this. So Editorially is itself built on top of an API. And each of those API calls has a number of, takes a particular functionality and abstracts it out to the smallest possible piece. So you can get a list of documents, you can fetch the highlights, you can save the text. That API powers the entire application itself and will eventually be available to other people who will build things with those features that we ourselves cannot imagine. So you want to build the tiniest possible pieces, knowing that what happens next is not going to be predictable. This is the opposite of designing a book, right? Where you have total control over the environment. Here you have none. David Yee, my co-founder and CTO, described this as understanding that the thing you're building today may be limited, misguided, or narrow, and you have to assume that it is in some of those ways, and make sure that what you put out there has the most possible flexibility, the tiniest parts that can be recontextualized and reshuffled to build something new. Now, if you think about that, you realize that this requires really getting your hands dirty. and going all the way down into the structure of what you're building. You're not only thinking about the surface of it. Now bear with me, because I'm going to wade into the whole should designers code argument. And that's kind of morphed into a should everyone code argument of late. I think those arguments miss two things. They tend to confuse literacy and fluency, and they treat all programming languages as monolithic. Let's talk about the first one. Being literate in a programming language means having an understanding of what it can do and what it can't, how it fits into the stack, when you would use it, when it's not available to you. So for example, I am literate in JavaScript in the sense that I have a sense of what JavaScript is capable of doing. I have a sense of the limitations of it, the things it's not particularly good at, the trouble spots. And if you gave me like an entire week and a case of beer a day, I might be able to hack together a tiny little prototype to show you the thing that I want to build and how I think it should work, right? It would weigh like 300 megs, and it wouldn't work in Internet Explorer, and it wouldn't be performant, and it would die if you gave it less than like the fastest possible bandwidth ever. But it would kind of work, right? That's what it means to be literate in a programming language. Fluency, especially on the web today, is a lot different. The languages of the web, the things that we're building, the web has matured a lot, and the things that we're building are really complicated. They're very sophisticated. Fluency takes the proverbial 10,000 hours or more. So if you're fluent in JavaScript, you can build something that's going to work in every browser, that's going to gracefully degrade to older devices, that's going to be really performant, that's never going to hang or deal with latency issues. That is a much more sophisticated kind of problem. Designers, as a whole, are probably not going to be fluent in very many programming languages, if any, but they sure as hell better be literate in as many as possible. The other side of this is the fact that it's easy for us to treat all programming languages as monolithic, right? Everything with a bracket is code. That tends to be how these conversations go. I think that's bullshit. HTML and CSS are not code. They are languages that describe the structure and style of what we do, and they are absolutely critical to our work as designers. Writing HTML and CSS is no more code than fiddling with the buttons in Photoshop is computer science. This is something that every designer needs to be really good at this. Now, you don't have to be as good at CSS as Ethan Marcotte. In fact, you won't be, believe me, I have tried. But you do want to get as good as you possibly can. That's part of the craft of our work. Now, if you think about the things I've just described and the way that the things that we're building come together, you quickly start to realize that it has a huge effect on how we work together, on what our teams look like, and how we collaborate. Jason Santamaria, my co-founder, and both A Book Apart and editorially, likes to talk about how his process has changed. So some years ago, this is what it looked like. You planned a website out, you designed it, you coded it, and then you shipped it, and you moved on to the next one, right? Mike Montero says we call this the waterfall process because at the end of it, you want to push your colleagues over the waterfall. But of course, this is not how we work anymore, right? It looks more like this. You design something, you code it, you go, oh, fuck, that's no good. You do it again, you code it, you put it in front of some users, you go, shit, they don't understand it. You do it again, and on and on and on and on and on. There isn't even this is kind of misleading, right? Because there's not one ship point. Editorially, and at Typekit, we deploy 3, 4, sometimes more times a day, depending on what's going on that day. You're constantly shipping. This has a huge impact in the shape of our teams. So it used to be that our teams kind of looked like this, right? This is 20th century industry. Very hierarchical. Every business throughout the entire century looked more or less like this. You had peers to your right and left, you had someone who you reported up to, and you had people who you delegated down to. Handoffs were very vertical. You would get an assignment from on high, you would consider it, you would pass it down below, it would come back up for approval. There wasn't a lot of back and forth. That's not what our teams look like anymore because it doesn't work for the kinds of things we're building now. Now our teams are more like this. Small, nimble teams are probably reshuffling at various points where the collaboration is consistent and ongoing, and there's a lot of back and forth. And we have to structure our teams differently as a result. So one of the things that Fluency requires, one of the things, the fact that the web is now complicated and harder, and the work that we're doing is more sophisticated, means we need a lot of specialists. On any given team, you're going to have someone who's really good at back-end design, really good at back-end architecture, someone who's really good at front-end, a content strategist, a researcher, maybe someone who's in charge of the business requirements. Each one of them have to be experts in their field. They have to be specialists, or it doesn't work. But a team of specialists don't make a good team. you have only specialists, you'd only have people who are really kind of in the weeds in their particular fields, they're going to have a hard time communicating. You need hybrids to hold those teams together. I like to think of hybrids who are people who have a more shallow knowledge in a lot of different fields, but can communicate and translate, kind of pollinate among the teams. Hybrids are the pollinators. They keep these teams working. Often, not always, but often, those hybrids are people like me who couldn't pick a single major in college and went on to do content work in their field, because content work is the kind of thing that allows you to kind of pursue a lot of different interests, and you don't really have to pick one thing. And the advantage of that is not only can they help communicate within the team, they are the person in the best position to tell your story to the outside world. So it's a win-win. About once a week, I get this question. We're looking for an art director who can also handle front-end development and do our taxes and knows all the legal issues surrounding patents. Do you know anyone offhand? I get it, right? This is the process where you're like, okay, I'm short on resources, and I understand that communication among teams is difficult. So if I get one person who can do everything, they can't possibly miscommunicate with themselves. Which is unfortunately not true. I miscommunicate with myself almost hourly. But it's also not scalable, right? You're not going to find enough people like this. You can't look for unicorns. You need to build balanced teams. Now, all of this changes also the way that we collaborate and the tools that we use to do so, and what that communication looks like. I work on a remote team. I'm a big fan of remote teams. Typekit was also built that way. And we use a ton of tools over the course of the day to actually talk to one another. We're in iChat and Campfire all day long, so Campfire for group chat and iChat for kind of one-on-ones. Campfire also has a whole lot of kind of ambient information rolling in, so support tickets and commit messages and deploys and so on. We use Trello to run our product, and we kind of run our stand-ups off of that and kind of get a sense of everything that's going on and who's doing what. We share longer messages over mini group and email, so things that require a little more in-depth writing and maybe kind of asynchronous communication. We're in GitHub all day long, filing issues and opening pull requests. We use the milestones feature in GitHub quite a lot to keep track of where we're at as we approach a particular release. We're on Google Hangouts because we're in different cities, so we get on Hangouts to kind of talk over the course of the day. Those Hangouts result in meeting notes to go into a variety of these other systems, sometimes multiple of those systems. Now you could look at this and say, Mandy, you're nuts. This is extremely inefficient. How would you even know where to put something if you found it? It's one of the things we tend to get caught up on when we talk about communication among teams is the efficiency. How quickly can you deliver information from one team member to the next? How quickly can we get to the next iteration? And that's really critical, but it is not the whole picture. A lot of what we're doing when we're sharing information on all these means is not simply delivering packets of knowledge from one person to the next. It's not like I have a thing in my head and I need to get it out and deposit it into Jason's head. There are a variety of more efficient ways to do that than everything you see on this screen. We're actually thinking collectively. We're thinking out loud. The work that we're doing is complicated and it requires a lot of collaboration. No feature comes together without everyone contributing to it in one way or another. So this is extremely inefficient, but also extremely powerful. The things that we've learned that kind of go against some of the kind of anti-meeting ideas I think that we hear in the industry these days, these are actually really, really useful. So we always share notes that from meetings that creates a kind of institutional memory and also make sure that we understand what people actually said. So you can have a phone call and think, okay, I get it. And then one of you writes up the notes and you go, oh no, wait, I heard something different. That's hugely valuable. We think of discussion as thinking, not as delivering of information, not necessarily as sharing something that you already know. There are more efficient ways to share. Those discussions are actually us thinking out loud together. And redundancy is super powerful in this context. So if you start off by talking about something on a Hangout, and then you chat about it in the Campfire, and then you follow up with some notes that are posted in an issue in GitHub, that is a good use of your time, even though it seems on the surface like a lot of overhead. I'm going to come back to that list. I think one of the places that we're in right now, as we navigate this paradigm shift, is that it's time for us to let go of the old paradigm and fully immerse ourselves in the new. And this is the hardest part. This is right at the end of the line. We really need to make a shift in how we think about things. I was chatting with a really good designer friend of mine recently, one of the best designers I know, wonderful guy. He was getting started on a new project. He was kind of figuring out the kind of scope of things and how he was going to work and how the project was going to come together, working with a new team. He was feeling really frustrated, and he blurted out, "I think I hate agile." Now, there's capital A agile, right? Capital A agile is a development practice that happens in textbooks, and near as I can tell, only textbooks. Nobody really does capital A agile in practice. No one I've met so far anyway. I'm willing to be proven wrong about that, but I've yet to meet someone who is actually following all of the rules that capital A agile actually proposes. But lowercase agile is something else. Lowercase agile is a thing we're all trying to do in our work. We're trying to move fast because we know we have to. And we're trying to move kind of quickly and effectively and iterate fast. This is kind of at the heart of what it means to be building for the web today. But it's hard. So I asked my friend, why? Why do you hate it? He said something really interesting. He said, the thing I'm making is going out in the world, and I want to yell, wait, I don't know if I mean it yet. I think that anxiety, that tentativeness, that sense that like you're not ready, is at the heart of a lot of what's happening with this shift right now. Used to be we had a lot of time to get comfortable with something, to kind of explore it in private before it went out into the world. And we don't have that luxury anymore. The things we make are going out into the world right away. And I think we also understand that that anxiety is kind of irrational. It's not really something that we need to be doing. It's something that kind of comes up, that bubbles up, that we need to let go of. But letting go is really hard, right? Simon Collison is a designer with fictive kin, gave a really great talk last fall at Brooklyn Beta. He called it the noise. He talked about how overwhelmed he could feel about the way our industry works and the way it is to live on the web today. How he'd open up his inbox and there's hundreds of emails that need his attention, and then he'd go to his RSS feed and there's thousands of unread items, and he'd open up Twitter and there's like tens of thousands of things labeled must read. If he actually spent the time to read everything that was called must read, he would never do anything else. And how unsustainable that was. He talked about the kind of looking into the void and just feeling like it was too much. He needed to avert his eyes. He was going to spend less of his time kind of putting stuff out willy-nilly and thinking harder about being more careful about the things that he put into the world. He was going to take time off, a day, a weekend, maybe even months or a whole year, just kind of turning off. I think the anxiety that Kali feels when he looks out into the web and sees that there's too much is the same anxiety that my friend feels when he works on something and realizes it's going out before he's ready. And I think that's something more fundamental than just the way we work as designers. The recognition that we are small and the universe is infinite is one of the basic facts of the human condition. It's part of what makes us people. I'm going to come back to that book, because I was a little bit dishonest at the beginning when I talked about the shift that we're navigating. I don't actually think that the book is being replaced by the web or the book is growing into the web. I think the book is becoming the thing it always wanted to be. So the book was never really static, right? Entire fields of textual scholarship have emerged to deal with the fact that books were never as static as they seemed. There are 3 versions of King Lear in the Oxford Shakespeare because we don't know which one is right. The book always seemed static, but wasn't really when you dug in. And the best publishers over the centuries have always understood that books weren't just products. They were a service. They were a service into the community and advocacy. Best publishers have always been able to understand that. And books were never really solitary or closed. The links between the books took longer to find, right? You had to dig into the bibliography and walk across the length of the library to find them, but so they weren't anywhere near as fast as a hyperlink, but they were there. And the design of a book was never as composed as it seemed like it could have been. As soon as you printed something, it went out and outside of your control, and people could write in the margins and scribble things out and tear up the pages, turn the book into something else. All that preciousness we felt about our designs was always misplaced. That just leaves that last one. That's the hardest one. So when my friend thinks about something going out into the world, when Kali thinks about all of the must-reads he's not going to get to, when every one of us obsesses over which to-do list app we're going to use and how many things we checked off today, this is the thing we're wrangling with. This is the last bit of the book paradigm that we continue to hold on to. We still think that our work should have a moment when it's finished. And it never was, and it never will be. If you think about this, you start to realize that as much as we kind of look for that, as much as we long for that, and I think it's the inheritance of the book that we have kind of picked up on, that this is always an illusion. And that unfinishedness that we now face ourselves, that we look out with and we cannot avoid seeing, doesn't have to be a curse. It can be a gift. Accepting that everything is unfinished allows you to accept that you don't have to be perfect, that we can judge things based on not how they are, but the potential for what they could be, on where things can go, not only where they're at this moment. It gives us permission to try and experiment in ways that we couldn't before. If you can accept the state of everything being unfinished, you can lift your foot up and fully engage in the new paradigm. And I think all of our work will be better for it. Thank you.